Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering this book. Second Person Rural, More Essays of a Sometime Farmer. A long time ago on this channel, I want to say 2 years ago, I covered the first book by Noel Perrin, a collection of essays, that being First Person Rural, and it's still on my shelf behind me. First Person Rural was published in 1978. Second Person Rural was published in 1980, and I think this copy a bit later than that. Or this copy was printed a bit later. Regardless, I think this copy only cost about $5, and I bought it in Virginia. It's a pretty interesting book. I want to say the best way to summarize the author's perspective on writing this book is by reading the introduction. I have always distrusted sequels. Well, not sequels per se. The Arabian Nights, which I love, consists of Scheherazade's original Midnight Story plus 1,000 sequels. Huckleberry Finn, the best book Mark Twain ever wrote, is the sequel to Tom Sawyer. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings as a sequel to his book about hobbits. What I distrust are sequels that advertise themselves as such by their titles. This phenomenon is most common in the worlds of children's books. An author will do one really nice book, say, The Adventures of a Little Ohio Farm Girl Named Karen and Her Still Smaller Brother, Kurt. Then over the next decade, 14 more books appear, and they are successively called Kurt and Karen Meet a Friend, Kurt and Karen Go to College, etc. Some may be good, some are sure to be worthless. All are trying to cash in on the success of the first volume. Each clutches a piece of the original title for that purpose. It's a low, contemptible practice like the son of titles that used to be common in movies a generation ago, or the Roman numeral titles that flourish now. The only movies worth seeing in which the final element of the title is a Roman numeral are called things like Henry V and Richard II, and there it wasn't even Shakespeare, let alone the film producer who put on the numeral. The Plantagenets came that way. In view of my contempt for Kurt and Karen books and Jaws 2 movies, I'm a good deal surprised to find myself writing a book with just their kind of title. This book openly offers itself as a sequel to First Person Rural. The rest of the foreword is just an explanation of how the First Person Rural book got its name, and then how for rural people it will have no meaning. The book will have no lessons for them. This is only something that people from bigger cities, more urban areas, are going to be able to learn from. So, a good example of the writing, which is very similar to First Person Rural, is this section about covered bridges in the essay simply titled, Isn't That the Cutest Bridge? Now, he's writing in 1980 when he says, There are 108 covered bridges left in Vermont. I am lucky enough to live 50 yards from one of them, close enough so that we can see it out the living room windows. And the following page is a beautiful picture depicting a scene later in the essay where he says artists would come down to the bridge and paint it. He describes how his town had 5 as recently as 1950, but the Army Corps of Engineers had to destroy 2 of them because they were in the way of a dam, and a third suffered from a lack of maintenance, and so it fell apart as well. And then a couple of years after Perrin moved into town, his bridge almost became the 4th to go. Some people wanted to destroy it and replace it with a modern concrete highway bridge, and they were supported, even pushed, by the one important businessman in town and by all the local loggers. The local loggers would have to circumvent any of these covered bridges because they couldn't pass under a 10-foot high ceiling with their logging. So their trucks were too tall. And that makes sense. But, as he says, in the primitive democracy of a small Vermont town, however, such things have to be voted on in town meetings. A good many natives liked the old bridge, and of course, all of us newcomers were hysterically eager to keep it. There were plenty of concrete bridges back where we came from. Ugly as sin, most of them. The first time I ever spoke in town meeting was in defense of the old bridge, and aided by the local patriarch, he'd carved his initials about 1906, and by testimony from a couple of covered bridge clubs, we defenders scored a great victory. That decision has given pleasure to a lot of people. The decision was to repair it. And then he describes on the bottom of that page, I saw an artist on her stool gazing so intently at the bridge that she utterly failed to notice the 6 cows standing just behind her, gazing intently at her. Cows can move as quietly as deer when they want to. So that's a good example of the kind of story you're getting in this one. It describes the covered bridges, the local area. He also has a really cute story to open up Vermont Silences, which is another essay. There is an old story about 2 Vermont farmers who lived a mile apart, one west of the village and the other east of it. Since rural free delivery didn't exist yet, each had to come into town to get his mail. Every weekday for 20 years, Eben would finish morning milking and come striding into the village from the west, while Alfred did the same thing from the east. Since both were punctual men, they invariably met in front of the post office at 9 a.m., just as the last letters were being put up. They'd say good morning, go in and get their mail, and stride off home, one west and one east. One morning during the 21st year, however, Eben came stumping out of the post office and, ignoring his usual route, started briskly south down the state highway. Alfred stared after him for a second and then called, Eben, where on earth you going? Eben whirled around. None of your goddamned business, he snapped. Then he added, visibly softening, and I wouldn't tell you that much if you wasn't an old friend. This story conforms perfectly to the stereotype of conversational habits in the country. City people talk a lot. The belief goes, but rubes are closed-mouthed. They think they've had a big conversation if one says he hears Harley's brown cow is going to calve, and the other answers, yup. For the first year or 2 that I lived in the country, I firmly believed in the stereotype. Even now I wouldn't call it wholly false. There is less badinage in the average milking parlor than in the average cocktail lounge. But I have since come to realize that words can fly as fast in the country as in town. It's just that rural conversation operates under a rather peculiar set of rules, and the rules do impose certain silences. What I love about this book, and especially the writing, is it calls to mind another book written in a similar era about a similar kind of community. And I'm going to take a minute to find that book so I can pull the copyright year for it and everything else. Like Woebegone Days was first copyright in 1985, and that's only 5 years after first and second person rural, but they're talking about a lot of the same things. How in those small rural communities, they don't talk a lot, but things travel across the whole area. They are mostly to themselves, but they're so together at the same time. As he says here, in the close to the essay about the covered bridge, it's a beautiful bridge and I still love it, but when a native friend looks at it thoughtfully, as one did in my presence not long ago, and muses out loud, it wouldn't take more than about 1 match on that dry wood, I do understand what he's talking about. Just a simple comment like that. He's not talking a whole conversation, just these are kind of the slower going topics of a smaller town. And what I love about this book is that it just expands on the kind of topics you get in the first one. And also, first person rural is a wonderful name. Second person rural is perfect because first person rural almost begs there to be a second and a third person rural to come after it. And sure enough, there is a third person rural. This book name, it doesn't have to necessarily be a sequel. It's the same kind of subject, the same kind of topics, because it's a collection of essays. It's not building on the previous one. Oh, well, 5 years ago I would have thought this, but now I think that. It's not that kind of sequel. It's more just to say life goes on and first has now become second. It's a beautiful name and it's a beautiful cover. Now, the cover of First Person Rural I have is more beaten and more worn down. That's because it was loaned out to a couple people in the summer of 2019. I had most of my books, the ones I really liked, in a bin in my car, and during the summer when I was working at that summer camp, if people wanted to read something and the library at the summer camp didn't have a book they wanted, they would come to me and ask, maybe you have a book. And I was loaning it out to some degree for that reason. Now, the person who borrowed First Person Rural didn't like that kind of essay. It was a bit too slow going. It was rural, but it was too slow for them to read. This, I love. It's just really the right kind of slow. There's a wonderfully rural sentiment in an essay titled The Rural Immigration Law. Each man kills the things he loves, Oscar Wilde wrote in a poem that later became a popular song. As a general statement, this won't do. But practically all tourists and most people who move to the country do kill the thing they love. They don't mean to. They may not even realize they have done it, but they still kill it. The tourist does it simply by being a tourist. What he loves is foreignness, difference, the exotic. So he goes in search of it and of course brings himself along. The next thing you know, there's a Holiday Inn in Munich. The case with people who move to the country is more complicated. What they bring along is a series of unconscious assumptions. It might be better for rural America if they brought a few sticks of dynamite or a can of arsenic. Take a typical example. Mr. and Mrs. Nice are Bostonians. They live a couple of miles off Route 128 in a 4-bedroom house. He's a partner in an ad agency. She has considerable talent as an artist. For some years, they've had a second home in northern New Hampshire. The kids love it up there in Grafton County. For some years, too, both Nices have been feeling they'd like to simplify their lives. They look with increasing envy on their New Hampshire neighbors who never face a morning traffic jam, or an evening one either, who don't have a long drive to the country on Friday night and a long drive back on Sunday, who aren't cramped into a suburban lot, who live in harmony with the natural rhythm of the year, who think the rat race is probably some kind of minor event at a county fair. And so he discusses how Mr. and Mrs. Nice move up. But then there's a couple problems. The schools aren't as good as the ones they had back in the urban life. The playground equipment is less modern. There's older school buses. Art instruction is worse at the high school. Pretty soon, Sue and Don join an informal group of newcomers in town who are working to upgrade education. All they want for starters is the new building, $2.8 million, and a majority of their kind on the school board. And then it discusses how Don, he does enjoy splitting wood, but he also likes to play golf, but there's no golf courses within 20 miles. So they begin to discuss the possibility of a 9-hole course. The old native who owns the land they have in mind seems to be keeping only 4 or 5 cows on it anyway. Besides, taxes are going up and the old fellow is going to have to sell sooner or later, which is too bad, of course. Don and Sue both admire the local farmers, and they're sincerely sorry whenever one has to quit. In short, if enough upper middle class people move to a rural town, they are naturally going to turn it into a suburb of the nearest city. For one generation, it will be a very nice and very rustic suburb, with real farms dotted around it, and real natives speaking their minds at town meeting. Then, as the local people are gradually taxed out of existence, or at least out of town, one more piece of rural America has died. This is happening to large parts of New England at the moment. The solution, as I see it, is a good, tough immigration law. It wouldn't actually keep Don and Sue out, it would just require them to learn rural values before they were allowed to stay. When they moved to the country, they would be issued visas good for 1 year. At the end of that year, they would have to appear before a local board composed entirely of native farmers, loggers, and road crewmen. They would then present evidence of having acclimated. It's a really interesting mentality. He's one of those people, though. I don't know if he's necessarily from a suburb or a city before he moved to this town, but he is a transplant to the town he lives in. And he started up with a lot of property that he had to maintain and was in a barter system to get dairy for some wood. He would get maple syrup. His first person rural covers a lot of that transition into the rural lifestyle. But now he's kind of settled in and adjusted, and he's complaining, which is funny to me because he did acclimate. And what he's asking is for other people to acclimate because they're ruining the thing they love. It's a really fascinating set of essays, and I love it so much. I've read it a couple times, and I recommend it to people. And if you find it on the shelves, I encourage you to pick it up and read it. And if you want to buy it online, that's an option too. But I really recommend finding it used. If you see it through sheer happenstance, buy it and enjoy it. So yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.